When the world woke up to the news on April 15, 1912, that the unsinkable Titanic had done just that, shock, grief, and despair spread like wildfire. With one question: how? Of course, everyone seems to agree on one fact. A ship really did sink in the icy waters of the North Atlantic, killing 1,500 people. But what people debate, even to this day, is what ship sank. Did the Titanic really perish, or is a much larger conspiracy afoot? The argument now is not that the Titanic didn't sink, but rather that the White Star Line switched ships, and the Titanic was actually an older ship. The Olympic and the whole thing was an insurance scam gone wrong. Let's go back a few years. There was a fierce competition for the British White Star Line, both domestically and internationally. Locally, it had a heated rivalry with the Cunard Steamship Company, which had launched the Lusitania and Mauretania, the two largest passenger ships in the world at the time, in 1906 and 1907. White Star Line engaged in a massive ship battle in an effort to outdo the Lusitania and its companion. The firm had experience in such conflicts, but the top speed of Cunard's Lusitania and Mauretania was superior to that of the White Star's so-called Big Four ships. The business had more financial support this time. The International Mercantile Marine Company, a holding firm funded by renowned investor J.P. Morgan, acquired White Star in 1902. White Star CEO J. Bruce Ismay started building what would later be known as Olympic-class ships with Morgan's approval. Olympic-class ships would be more opulent and larger than Cunard ships if they couldn't match the speed of the Lusitania. The Olympic, Titanic, and Britannic were three of the vessels that were put into service. As the name of the line, the Olympic was the first ship to be constructed and was regarded as the leading ship. Its initial voyage was well publicized, and its first few trips were resounding triumphs. After only 5 trips, the ship experienced major problems. On September 20th, 1911, the Olympic performed an abrupt turn as it approached the HMS Hawke, a naval ship. Unprepared, the two ships collided. The Olympic was able to limp back to port, but it was in bad shape. A trial would later hold the White Star Line responsible for the incident, meaning they not only needed to fork out the repairs for their own ship, but they were also liable for any damages made to the HMS Hawke. After the crash, the Olympic was an economic disaster. The lawsuit meant repairs wouldn't be covered by insurance, and it wasn't drawing any money while sitting around the docks. So, they devised a plan. It was straightforward. White Star Line would simply swap the Olympic for the Titanic, sink the Olympic, now posing as the Titanic, and then file a compensation claim. No one, aside from those at the top of the White Star Line ladder, would have ever known that they'd switched the ships, because if you looked at the ships when they were side by side, they were identical. Unless you looked at the nameplates on both ships. The Olympic's floors were covered with carpet as soon as the plan was put into motion, because the Olympic had tile flooring, which would have allowed passengers and personnel who had been on the Olympic before the Titanic to see footprints left by earlier passengers. People would have questioned why this brand new ship, which had never been aboard, was covered in footprints and beverage spill stains if they hadn't done this. Other aspects of the ship would have also been altered, such as replacing the Olympic promenade on the B deck with staterooms from the real Titanic to further enhance the plausibility of the switch. The portholes on the sea deck are one feature that enables passengers to distinguish between the two ships. The Titanic had 14 portholes that were evenly placed when it was pictured while it was being built, but it had 16 that were unevenly spaced when it set sail on her fateful maiden voyage. Another factor, and probably the biggest win for this conspiracy, actually involved the ship's owner, J.P. Morgan, and 50 other first-class passengers. J.P. Morgan was supposed to be traveling on the Titanic's maiden voyage, but abruptly canceled shortly before the ship left Southampton, alleging that he was too sick to travel, when in reality he had been seen 2 days later in France and appeared to be in excellent health. Julia, White Star Line chairman Bruce Ismay's wife, and their children had originally canceled their space on the voyage, owing to Julia's illness, but they were afterwards photographed on a driving vacation in Wales. What made the elite of the White Star Line suddenly cancel their voyage? On top of this, 7 priceless bronze statues were also removed by J.P. Morgan an hour before the ship departed Southampton. The fact that J.P. Morgan publicly addressed the nation and confirmed that he would unquestionably be on the ship leads many people to conclude that they both knew what was about to occur with the ship on its inaugural voyage. Was J.P. Morgan's lie motivated by his knowledge of the ship's impending sinking? Adding to the mounting evidence, the people who had built the Titanic back in the Harland and Wolff Belfast shipyard in 1909 have also come out over the years and said that the two ships were in fact swapped. And if they told anyone, White Star Line told them it would be their last job they ever did. On July 31st, 1996, an Australian man wrote a letter to the Northern Star newspaper in which he described a conversation that his son had with Paddy Fenton, who worked on the construction of the Titanic. The remaining crew members were pulled aside and met by 2 individuals when they arrived at port. One of the guys held a high position in the firm, and the other man held a very high position in the government. The government official read the crew the Official Secrets Act, saying that they would serve a minimum of 20 years in prison and would never be able to find employment when they were released if they revealed the true cause of the sinking or the rumors of an insurance scheme. The firm decided to make a change, renaming its older, damaged ship the Titanic and giving its newly constructed second ship the name Olympic. The real Olympic would eventually be scuttled in an accident, allowing the White Star Line to get an insurance payout appropriate for a brand new ship, while the vessel that was initially intended to be the Titanic would have continued to operate. An iceberg was the only thing that derailed the plan. Or was it? Some survivors, when interviewed, never even spoke of an iceberg, instead talking about how an explosion was the cause of the ship's demise. 25-year-old Armenian publicist Vakhanak Bayurait boarded the ship like everyone else in Southampton, where he met 3 men with whom he shared cabin 804. They were 2 Englishmen and a French guy from Alsace named Marin. Because Marin and Vakhanak were around the same age, and Vakhanak could speak excellent French, they quickly became friends. They went to bed rather late on April 14th, just like on their other Titanic nights. Shortly after midnight, something that sounded like a big explosion woke everyone up. The nightlights went out, and the Englishmen fell off their bunks because of a strong push. One of them injured his head, and another hurting his arm. The 2 new friends helped them up, took a few belongings with them, and left the cabin, not knowing they would never step back in it. But Vakhanak only took his passport and all the cash he had, 43 British pounds. After his survival, he went on to write memoirs accounting his ordeal, but never does he mention an iceberg, only 2 explosions. Vakhanak isn't the only witness to come forward about the explosions. In an inquest into the disaster, several witnesses came forward to describe what they heard. Alfred Oliver, a quartermaster, answered in his testimony below. In the courtroom, Senator Burton asked, "Did you hear explosions?" Mr. Oliver replied, "I heard several little explosions, but it was not such explosions as I expected to hear. This prompted Senator Burton to further question, were these before or after she sank? Oliver responded by saying, before she sank, and while she was sinking. Another witness, Major Arthur G. Pushin, a first-class passenger, also talked of the possibility of an explosion, saying, "It was intact at the time. I feel sure that an explosion had taken place in the boat, because in passing the wreck the next morning, we steamed past it. I just happened to think of this, which may be of some assistance to this inquiry. I was standing forward, looking to see if I could see any dead bodies or any of my friends, and to my surprise, I saw the barber's pole floating. The barber's pole was on the sea deck, my recollection is. The barber shop. And that must have been a tremendous explosion to allow this pole to have been broken off from its fastenings and drift with the wood. So, if the ship exploded, what caused it? Well, these and other witness accounts of the explosion are backed up by aerospace engineer turned author John Wickman in his book, Titanic, The Hidden Evidence. In it, he describes how because the Titanic's engineers were unaware of how to turn off the electricity to the submerged areas of the ship, electrolysis, a process that turns seawater into vast amounts of both hydrogen and harmful chlorine gas, began to occur. It was just a matter of time before the hydrogen gas was ignited by a little spark or flame, resulting in an explosion that blew a hole in the side of the ship. This hole is actually supported in later photographic evidence of the ship too. According to Wickman, the initial explosion occurred between 1:10 and 1:20 a.m. He said that the eventual capsizing was caused by a second explosion that split the ship in half, which was witnessed. So, was it pure human error? Well, another theory suggests that a German U-boat in the region was to blame. Even though World War I hadn't yet begun, some speculate that a German U-boat may have attacked the British ship. Several survivors claim they saw a ship lurking miles away until dawn. However, there is no evidence of this. But it's interesting to note that the RMS Lusitania was sunk in 18 minutes as a result of a German U-boat strike in 1915. So, it's still out there as a possibility. Of course, after what we've heard today, who knows what to believe?
The Titanic, the greatest ship ever was known, making its first sails across the sea. Everybody's loaded up and waving their glad hands goodbye. Captain Smith at Howdy Machinery, all right?
Recently released an incredible three-dimensional scan of the shipwreck of the Titanic. I mean, look at it. It's absolutely amazing. Just one problem that I have with this whole thing. Where is the sideswipe damage that was supposedly to have occurred from that iceberg that sank the ship?
Okay, we're all familiar with the story of the Titanic, you know, how it struck an iceberg and sank. No one questions that. Indeed, no one even thinks to question that. Everybody just thinks it's, you know, re ipsa loquitur. But is that really the case? Because now experts are showing pretty compelling evidence that it might not have hit an iceberg at all. You know, 3D models of the wreck now don't show any damage where the iceberg supposedly struck. So anyway, I'm going to explore this possibility. And that's what it is, a possibility. You know, when it comes to things like this, you never really know for sure. But all you can do is look at the evidence. So that's what we're going to look at, the evidence. Several experts on the Titanic now claim that new 3D images may prove that the vessel did not hit an iceberg. The boat famously sank in the Atlantic Ocean more than a century ago, and now new digital scans have been released that may reveal more information about the infamous crash. Parks Stevenson, who has extensively studied the ship, says there is evidence to suggest that the vessel did not hit an iceberg along its side, as the multiple Oscar-winning 1997 film suggests, with the first full-size 3D scan of the ship's wreckage being created. And look here, look at the cursor here. See along here, this is where the iceberg supposedly struck, right in here. And as you can see, there's nothing. You know, there's that there, but that's not iceberg damage. Right along in here is where it supposedly hit, and you can't see it. So anyway, there are multiple explanations for this, some pretty plausible, some kind of far out there, and I'm going to look at both of them just right now.
A complete 3D reconstruction of the shipwreck of the Titanic was released last week, and it reveals the ship like we've never seen it before. This 3D scan took over 200 hours of dive time to complete. It was assembled from more than 700,000 images taken from every conceivable angle. Now, of course, the beginning portion of that iceberg damage will be concealed by the muddy bottom built up around the bow of the ship as it collided with the ocean floor at a speed of more than 30 miles per hour. That all makes sense, and it accounts for why we can't see the initial impact point of the iceberg. But here's my problem with the whole thing. According to witness statements, the hull breach extended along the starboard side of the ship, past Boiler Room 5 and Boiler Room 6. Plus, we can see the shading of the red oxide paint from the very bottom of the ship right here. Combine those two facts, and in my mind, there can only be one conclusion. That iceberg did not scrape the side of the ship as we have been led to believe for over 100 years.
Now, the most plausible explanation for the whole thing doesn't require a lot of in-depth analysis because it's so simple and really kind of obvious. That being that the iceberg struck the bottom of the ship and caused it to go down, which would prevent anyone from being able to see the evidence from the wreckage because of all the debris and muck that's piled up around the ship, and simply because the ship is sitting right side on the bottom. However, there's a more interesting and tantalizing explanation that I'm going to explore that you know may or may not be true, but still, you know, it seems kind of remotely plausible to me. And it all revolves around the establishment of the Federal Reserve Bank. Now, most people don't realize that the Federal Reserve Bank is a private bank owned by people. I've looked to try to discover who owns it. It's kind of a shadowy clique, but there are some people who own that bank who make a ton of money off us. The dollar bill that you carry in your pocket is not American money. It is an instrument of debt back to the Federal Reserve Bank. We borrow the money we spend, and then we pay it back with the very money that we borrowed in the first place. It's kind of a Ponzi scheme. It causes inflation. But anyway, in 1912, this guy here, J.P. Morgan, who worked for the Rothschilds in England, he wanted to start a central bank, the Federal Reserve Bank. But there were some guys who didn't want to do that. John Jacob Astor, Asa Strauss, and Benjamin Guggenheim, and those three guys were all on the Titanic. It's said that they opposed the bank. I've also read experts who said that they didn't oppose the bank, but most people say that they opposed the bank. Now, Morgan owned the Titanic. He owned the company, the White Star Line, that ran the Titanic. And he was slated to be on the maiden voyage, but he backed out. Not only him, but some of his buddies, his cronies, backed out too. And so the ship sank, and those three guys died. And then the very next year, Without anyone to oppose the Federal Reserve, it was established. They voted on it in Christmas Eve, 1913. There wasn't a quorum. It was not legal, but they did it anyway. And because of that, we got the Federal Reserve Bank. It's kind of an inspirational story, the story of Astor on the Titanic. He was the world's richest man. I guess you could call him the Elon Musk of the Gilded Age. And he had a chance to get on the lifeboat, but instead he relinquished his seat to a woman and her daughter. And he went down with the ship, which, was very honorable and inspirational. But you got to ask yourself, wouldn't the world have been better off if he had taken the seat on the boat? Powerful men, a lot of times they don't really think about the influence they have and the importance of their existence to the human race. And instead, he chose to do the good thing. But, okay, there were several passengers, though, that reported they heard explosions. They didn't hear a grinding or a scraping. They heard explosions. And I got this from an AI. I'm just going to read this off here. Several passengers and crew members on the Titanic reported hearing an explosion or a series of explosions before the ship sank. Some of these accounts include Lawrence Beasley, a second-class passenger, mentioned in his book, The Loss of the SS Titanic, that he heard two distinct explosions, with the second one being much louder than the first. Harold Bride, the wireless operator, claimed that he heard an explosion and then a rush of water into the ship's wireless room. Charles H. Lightoller, the second officer of the Titanic, stated that he heard an explosion and then a rush of water into the area he was located. Violet Jessup, a stewardess on the Titanic, also mentioned hearing an explosion. And then last but not least, the captain of the RMS Carpathia, which picked up survivors, sent to rescue survivors, reported hearing an explosion while still some distance away from the Titanic. So here are all these people, and these are just some of them, who reported hearing explosions. I got this from an AI. I don't remember if I mentioned that already, but I got it from an AI. Who knows? But anyway, it's food for thought. There was an explosion. Here's where it gets kind of outlandish and kind of creepy. Several passengers and crew members of the Titanic are reported to have claimed they saw a submarine or a periscope near the sinking ship. Some of these individuals include, and then most of them have already been mentioned. I'll go over again. Charles H. Lightoller. He said that he heard a noise that sounded like a propeller shortly before the ship sank. And he saw a periscope. Violet Jessup, the stewardess, stated that she saw a periscope and heard a noise that sounded like a propeller. Lawrence Beasley, the second-class passenger, he said he saw a periscope and a noise that sounded like a propeller. Harold Bride, the wireless operator, heard a noise that sounded like a propeller and saw a periscope. All these people, and these aren't all of them, but these four, and then the captain of the Titanic himself. The captain of the Titanic reportedly said that he saw a periscope or a submarine in the area. Now, are all these people stupid? Are all these people hallucinating? And like I said, these aren't the only people who reported such a thing. And why would they have said that? You know, there was the iceberg, because the iceberg was there. Why would they have said it? Why wouldn't they have just assumed that the boat hit an iceberg? That's the reasonable assumption and conclusion. But yet they said they saw a submarine. There were also several people that said that they saw a vessel shining a spotlight on the wreck and on the passengers in the water, and that it disappeared. So it's as if a submarine surfaced to look to see what they'd done and then went back under. And once again, are they all hallucinating? Are they stupid? Oh, but wait, they're not experts. But anyway, people discount that possibility because they just say, well, they say it was a German submarine. That's what they conclude baselessly. And they say, well, we weren't at war with Germany. They didn't sink the Titanic like they did the Lusitania a few years later because we weren't at war with them. Oh, my goodness. But ask yourself, and this is where conspiracy people miss a very big possibility. Does it have to be a German submarine? Does it even have to be a state actor? Huh? When you're dealing with people the likes of Morgan and the Rothschilds, don't you think that they could buy their own submarine and have their own private submarine? So, you know, guys like Morgan, they could have bought their own submarine. It's my personal conspiracy theory. And of course, you know, they wanted to get rid of Astor and those guys because they wanted to start the bank the next year. So anyway, that's, you know, it's kind of intriguing to think of that. You know, it's plausible. However, the most likely conclusion was that the iceberg struck the bottom of the ship. However, like I've said multiple times already, these people, they're not stupid. The people who reported that, they're not crazy. And they reported the same thing independently of one another.
Another theory that explained the explosion claimed that there was a German U-boat involved in the sinking of the Titanic. The Armenian writer was, in fact, not the only survivor who mentioned they heard explosion sounds coming from somewhere deep in the bowels of the ship. And they'd also claimed they'd seen a searchlight coming from some ship shortly after Titanic had sunk. It wasn't a vessel hurrying to the rescue, so it could have actually been a submarine that surfaced to see what it had done to the legendary ship.
I posted an Instagram reel last week, a 60-second video which was part 1 of which I wanted to be a series, and it went viral. Granted, on my old account that was before big tech axed it at its heels. The video explained, in general, some shady things regarding the whole Titanic story. You can watch the video for yourself. Many of you, after watching this, wanted a part 2 to this video, but frankly, 60 seconds is just not enough to get into the details. And that is why, in this mini documentary, we're going to dive deep into the mystery of the sinking ship. Now, before we get into this video is purely speculative. It's open for conjecture. Hey, you can even call me a crazy conspiracy nut. I say this to say, don't believe a word of this video. I just encourage you to conduct your own self-research and see what you find for yourself. Before we can even speak about the Titanic and the series of events that unfolded before its calamitous sinking, we must take ourselves back to the date 1910, where 7 men held a secret meeting that would not only change the lives of every American, but the lives of every future generation around the world. That is, the secret meeting at Jekyll Island, which set the foundations of the creation of the Federal Reserve Bank.
Nelson Aldrich, Benjamin Strong Jr., Piet Andrew, Henry Davidson, Arthur Shelton, Frank Vanderlip, and Paul Warburg met at the Jekyll Island Club off the coast of Georgia to write a plan to reform the nation's banking system. The meeting and its purpose were closely guarded secrets, and participants did not admit that the meeting occurred until the 1930s. But the plan written on Jekyll Island laid a foundation for what would eventually be the Federal Reserve System. One could call the Federal Reserve a cartel, and that its primary interest is to advance the goals of the cartel itself. This attribution has been stated many times by Edward G. Griffin, the author of the book Creatures of Jekyll Island, which details the sinister plot behind the meeting that took place that secretive day.
In standard education, meaning Rockefeller indoctrination, we're taught that the Federal Reserve Bank was created to alleviate financial crises that became frequent prior to its establishment, and to provide a more centralized control over the financial system, aka the banks. Well, let's just break apart that story, and we'll start by a quote from Edward G. Griffin. The accepted version of history is that the Federal Reserve was created to stabilize our economy. One of the most widely used textbooks on this subject says it sprang from the panic of 1907. With its alarming epidemic of bank failures, the country was fed up once and for all with the anarchy of unstable private banking. Even the most naive student must sense a grave contradiction between this cherished view and the system's actual performance. Since its inception, it has presided over the crashes of 1921 and 1929, the Great Depression of 29 to 39, recessions in 53, 57, 69, 75 and 81, a stock market Black Monday in 87, and 1,000% inflation which has destroyed 90% of the dollar's purchasing power. So, as you can see, the Federal Reserve failed at its main duty till this date, which was to provide financial stability for the American dollar. Secondly, the 7 men who secretly plotted the creation of the Federal Reserve Bank were some of the richest men in the country with banking interests themselves. In other words, the Federal Reserve Bank and all the rules within were created by banksters to control banking behavior. Go figure. It reminds me of the quote, "Those with the gold make the rules." That's the golden rule. So, if the Federal Reserve Bank didn't stabilize the American economy, nor take the power away from the power-hungry bankers, then what did it actually do? Today, the Federal Reserve Bank has a colossal power over the American economy, and the rest of the world too. It's responsible for absurd inflation, economic bubbles, and bailing out their banking buddies. It keeps the wealthy wealthy and the working class limited to their potential. It just about controls the lives of every American citizen, politician, corporation, market, and a whole lot more. That's what it did. It consolidated power in the hands of just a few men. So, you're probably wondering by now, what does this all have to do with the Titanic?
The idea of a Federal Reserve System wasn't completely accepted by the entire population. Those with other financial interests knew this could wreak havoc on the economy. And a centralization of money supply smells like a disaster waiting to happen. So, as you can imagine, many prominent men during the early 1900s also opposed its creation. 3 of the more notable men who had grown to great riches opposed the creation of the Federal Reserve vehemently. These men were John Jacob Astor, Benjamin Guggenheim, and Isa Strauss. All 3 men died on the Titanic that fateful night. Is it a coincidence that 3 of the most powerful men that opposed the secret plan died on the unsinkable ship? Well, let's look deeper, shall we?
J.P. Morgan, one of America's largest financiers and a huge political influencer, and of course a bankster, was a key character involved in this conspiracy. Conspiracy in quotations, that is. Not only did he own the private lodge on Jekyll Island, where the secret meeting took place, he was one of the biggest advocates for the Federal Reserve Bank. According to Investopedia, he ultimately forced the government into acting on the central banking plans. Did I forget to mention, he also owned White Star Lines, the company that built the Titanic? According to this article from historyonthenet.com, in 1902 the company was bought by a wealthy American, J. Pierpont Morgan. Ismay retained his position within the firm as managing director, Ismay being the previous owner of White Star Lines. Morgan's money meant that the company could build large luxury liners to attract the wealthy passengers. In 1907, Ismay suggested that the company build 2 liners which were heavier, bigger and more luxurious than any other ship in the world. They were to be called the Olympic and Titanic. If these were successful, a third gigantic, later renamed Britannic would follow. I can't help but wonder about the fact that they had this genius idea to build the biggest and most luxurious ship a few years prior to the secret meeting. So, JP Morgan pushes for the creation of the Federal Reserve, has a genius idea to create a luxurious, unsinkable ship 2 to 3 years prior to the disaster. On board that ship were 3 of his greatest threats to the sinister plan, and all 3 men died on that night. It seems oddly suspicious, come to think of it, but this is just the surface. There are many more facts to this puzzling story. Let's take a look.
JP Morgan was actually booked to be on the Titanic in one of the parlor suites, which were one of the most luxurious suites on the entire ship. However, he cancelled his reservation days before it set sail. The information is unclear as to why he cancelled or the actual date he cancelled. There seems to be a lot of confusion on this matter. My observation shows that mainstream fact-checking websites, such as Reuters, claim it wasn't days before, and alternative news platforms suggest it was. You can be the judge of this yourself. Either way, he cancelled, and that's interesting alone. A powerful man like JP Morgan had a lot of friends who also had their own companies, and one of them was Milton Hershey. The world's most famous chocolate bar was started by Milton Hershey, and his business would dominate the sweet tooth industry. A side note, an industry that would appease the addictions and desires of men, keep them craving for satiation, and an industry heavily contributable to men's health problems. But we'll leave that for another time. Milton Hershey also cancelled his reservation. Is it possible that JP Morgan warned his good old business associate? Many sources suggest that Mr. Hershey cancelled under business matters. This is highly perplexing because this is supposed to be one of the greatest events to happen in that era, an unsinkable, gigantic ship to sail over the Atlantic, and the first ever to do so. It was a luxurious boat too, with many wealthy and prominent men on board. I'm sure it would have also served as a great networking opportunity for these business moguls. For him to cancel last minute, just as JP Morgan did, his friend who owns the colossal ship, is more than bizarre.
3 of the 7 men that attended the slithery meeting on Jekyll Island in 1910, Charles D. Norton, Benjamin Strong, and Henry Davison, were all in a close association with JP Morgan. And it is suggested that these 3 men went to represent JP Morgan. Quick research can show you their connection with JP Morgan himself, as many of them managed his companies and trusts. Nelson Aldrich and Frank Vanderlip represented the Rockefeller dynasty, as Nelson Aldrich was the father-in-law to the American financier John Davison Rockefeller Jr. Frank Vanderlip, president of the National City Bank of New York, representing William Rockefeller, and the international investment banking house of Kuhn, Loeb & Company. Paul Warburg, a partner of Kuhn, Loeb & Company, a representative of the Rothschild banking dynasty in England and France, and the brother of Max Warburg, who was the head of the Warburg Banking Consortium in Germany and the Netherlands. These 7 men were tentacles of much more powerful families that have an agenda to rule over society by infiltrating major industries and markets around the world. The Rockefeller dynasty, the Rothschilds family, and the Morgans. These 3 families alone hold tremendous wealth and power that influence major political, scientific, and societal decisions.
Another part to this endless puzzle has to do with the Serbian inventor and forgotten genius, Nikola Tesla. If you're watching this video, you're most likely familiar with Nikola Tesla's work. If not, you have definitely been influenced by his inventions. Some of Tesla's most notable inventions were his AC power, alternating current, Tesla coil, magnifying transmitter, Tesla turbine, shadowgraph, radio, neon lamp, hydroelectric power, induction motor, and radio-controlled boat. The TV remote in your room to the military-grade weapons systems have all manifested through the great mind of Nikola Tesla.
Here is where the puzzle gets puzzling. Both J.P. Morgan and Jacob Astor were funding Nikola Tesla's work, and Jacob Astor was revered as a great friend of Nikola Tesla himself. According to TeslaUniverse.com, in March 1901, Tesla agreed terms with J.P. Morgan for $150,000, which is around $4.5 million in today's currency. In exchange, Tesla would be required to hand over 51% in interest for his patents and inventions to J.P. Morgan. John Jacob Astor was also one of Tesla's wealthiest and most generous investors. He invested $100,000 in 1899 for Tesla to, as he understood it, further develop and produce a new lighting system. Tesla instead used the money to fund his Colorado Springs experiments. Jacob Astor was understandably unhappy with Tesla's deception and avoided him for several years. They later reconciled and worked together on aircraft and propulsion systems in 1908. It is believed that J.P. Morgan cut Tesla's funding in 1901 after Tesla's ambitions became too lofty and conflicted with J.P. Morgan's other interests. Big oil. Tesla wanted free electricity for everyone, but this wouldn't serve the money-hungry oligarchs at the time. Nikola Tesla was defunded and basically reduced to destitution by his investors who pulled out on him. J.P. Morgan and Westinghouse and so forth, who pulled out on him when they realized that the worldwide energy system that he was trying to develop was something that could not be metered and monetized. And this was, of course, in the age of discovery of petroleum and Rockefeller as the first magnate of the petroleum industry, and there was a killing to be made in oil and other non-renewable sources. So Tesla was reduced to destitution and misery for wanting to be a benefactor of humanity. Jason Reza Georgiani.
With John Jacob Astor close to Tesla and being one of his more ambitious investors, could J.P. Morgan see his relationship as a threat to his global empire? It is clear by now that John Jacob Astor was a real thorn in the side of J.P. Morgan. With his widely known concerns about the Federal Reserve Bank and his interest and friendship with Nikola Tesla, the man who was on the brink of creating free electricity for the entire world, J.P. Morgan had to do something about his opposition. Right? That's how business works, and history has always shown us the rage man has when it comes to removing his opponents, especially when it interferes with business. Again, this is all speculation, but using our God-given discernment, we can almost put the pieces to the puzzle together. And the picture becomes clearer each and every time we do that. Is it possible that JP Morgan killed two birds with one stone, and that stone was to sink the unsinkable ship? Is it possible that with John Jacob Astor out the way, JP Morgan could go on and continue his global business dominance?
There are many other facts about the story we've been told regarding the Titanic, pondered off as coincidence, that paint a very sinister plot to the story. Facts such as Captain E.J. Smith ignored multiple iceberg warnings from his crew and other ships. Getting from England to New York as fast as possible was a goal number one at the behest of his boss, Joseph Bruce Ismay, managing director of the White Star Line. Ismay had pressure from his boss, J.P. Morgan, owner of White Star Line. By the way, Ismay survived the catastrophe. Or another fact, once the Titanic struck the iceberg, the captain and his crew used white flares to signal distress. Unfortunately, white flares are not the colour used to signal distress. Red flares are. They're always used to show distress. So the closest ship, the Californian, ignored the flares, assuming it was a celebratory signal rather than an emergency. Oops. Just two other coincidences, I guess. If you're like me, your eyebrows are raising. You're questioning the official story because it is clear mainstream educational sources don't want us knowing about these connections. What are they trying to hide? When you trace the rabbit hole, you only come to one conclusion, and that is they're hiding the truth. The truth that the creation of one of the biggest conduits for control the world has ever seen, the Federal Reserve Bank. Or is everything that I have presented to you in this video an utter lie? Does the rabbit hole go deeper? What if I told you, after researching and reaching the deep catacombs of the internet world, I found information that suggests the Titanic never even sank? What if I told you that the whole story was fabricated using fake imagery and falsified news articles? Would you want to find out more? If you want a part 2 of this compelling story, please consider liking, commenting, and sharing this video. And if you haven't already, please subscribe to our YouTube channel. Thank you for watching, and hopefully I will catch you in the next video.
I'll read it for you. He was the one that's down in the Ocean Gate along with his son, who was going to take over the business and help him roll out power to Pakistan. And they weren't going to roll out power the traditional way of putting the copper lines up there and dragging it like they were doing up to Mount Everest for the Chinese. If you've seen those videos, got ant lines dragging high tension cables up the mountains. Nope. They were just going to go straight up Parandev magnetic motors and put them in villages. Microhydro along the streams, Parandev magnetic motors in there. Forget your solar panels, don't need them. We're going to get more reliable power from the Earth's magnetic field than you ever would from the sun. I mean the photons, not the actual magnetic field. Got to split the hair there. So anyway, Pakistani billionaire involved in new currency, central bank digital currency. You know, he's one of the most powerful, influential families. Of course, he's invited to the table. And welcome back. Thank you for staying around. Joining me, David Dubine, your host right here, Mini Ice Age Conversations every other Friday, 2 to 3 p.m., Brighteon TV, uncensored. Let's go deep. And when I talk about that, depth. And where depth can be used in many ways. Depth of the money supply, depth of water, or the depths of corruption and entanglement in industries across our planet, from central banking to energy, manufacturing, and everything in between. Now let's do a chapter of history. I'm going to wind a little bit further back, 100 plus years ago, into modern oceanic events mixed in with Tesla technologies, and see how this all weaves into a story. It's almost so unbelievable that when I was putting it together today, I was thinking, wow, this is just beyond bizarro. It's more like a Twilight episode Twilight Zone episode than it would be real life when we start to put the pieces together. But as we see here, the depth of money cycles, very familiar. Titanic, the movie, 1912. But what really went on at that time? So there's some back and forth between, the true events of what happened with these three, what quote unquote billionaires, or they were millionaires of their time, but in today's monies, they would all be billionaires, the biggest magnates of hotels and industries, mining with the Guggenheim. So another thing they all had in common, they didn't want anything to do with the Federal Reserve formation back before it was formed. They were invited to the meetings. They objected to them. And then what happened on Jekyll Island is another step in history itself. But it's interesting that those three that all opposed the Federal Reserve were on the Titanic. J.P. Morgan was supposed to be, but then pulled out at the very last second and didn't sail. They did. They were gone. They all lost their lives. Now, Nikola Tesla is also intertwined with J.P. Morgan. Free energy, we can't have that. Because see, Nikola Tesla was about to put out wireless power and understood that you didn't need to burn anything. You didn't need to drill for oil, mine for coal. We didn't need to do any mining to get copper out here either. We would have a wireless world where we wouldn't need any copper cabling. So trace over the last 120 years, how much money has been made just from copper that we wouldn't have needed in any way, shape, or form. So trace back 120 years and think about how the world is today. If we didn't need to burn anything, mine for anything, and we were just using the Earth's magnetic field to power all of our devices that we do burn stuff now to make the spindle move, you could have done that with the Earth's magnetic field with magnets. And then we come to today. Shahzada Dawood. The story is, at least the mainstream media, he was never associated with the World Economic Forum. He never wanted to do free power. It was central bank digital currency. He was all for it. But then the next hand it says, oh, he was never associated with the World Economic Forum and had nothing to do with it. That's all hearsay. And I'm like, whoa. All right. So it's pretty easy to backtrack this stuff. It's on the net. And they couldn't have scrubbed it all that quickly. So when we do look at it here, I'll read it for you. He was the one that's down in the Ocean Gate along with his son, who was going to take over the business and help him roll out power to Pakistan. And they weren't going to roll out power the traditional way of putting the copper lines up there and dragging it like they were doing up to Mount Everest with the Chinese. If you've seen those videos, got ant lines dragging high tension cables up the mountains. Nope. They were just going to go straight up Parandev magnetic motors and put them in villages. Microhydro along the streams, Parandev magnetic motors in there. Forget your solar panels, don't need them. We're going to get more reliable power from the Earth's magnetic field than you ever would from the sun. I mean, the photons, not the actual magnetic field. Got to split the hair there. So anyway, Pakistani billionaire involved in new currency, central bank digital currency. He's one of the most powerful, influential families. Of course, he's invited to the table. But he was doing so many other things also to leave his legacy. It was far about the money at that point. This guy is more about legacy, positive legacy for the planet, being remembered throughout history of helping humanity, not destroying it. So when you start to, frame in this kind of mind into what they and his family and group wanted to do in Pakistan, it takes a whole different twist than just some greedy dude up there wanting to electrify the country. So if we read a little bit more about, he'd spoken at the World Economic Forum on several occasions. Now this is off of Wikipedia and it says failed verification. And I know they just changed that, because it says that means that you can't be verified. So if anybody was going to do a quick search, they go, oh, no, he wasn't there. He was not a speaker at the World Economic Forum. But he's also heavily involved in women's rights and bringing up from the poverty level, starting with women in these remoter villages, this from the farm to the farm gate and, the agricultural sectors of it and just different ways for people to make money in the country and bring up the livelihood of everybody in the country so the entire country prospers, not just a single segment. He was all over about vast networking out into giving everybody the same opportunity to have rural power. And that way they could, with their farm goods, process them out in the countryside versus having to bring them in and the wholesalers take a huge gouge out of it and then it gets sent to a city. He's like, we're going to do it out there. We're going to start at the community level and we'll bring it back into the cities versus the other way around. So here's Just go to the World Economic Forum. You can find he got his own page there, his own page. And look at it. He is a member of the Global Advisory Board for Prince Charles Charity and Prince's Trust International. Now, in addition to that, there's a slew of, and he's also sitting on a board of directors in SETI. All right, what's that all about too? Like this guy's fingers are everywhere in every single industry or leading new technologies coming out on the planet. And he was going to innovate and put some of those into the rest of the remote countryside. Now, can you imagine being remembered that in history in your country for doing that? So if I could read to you in the blue, in case you're just listening along while you're, doing something else, including the World Economic, it says, Shahzada is a leading voice for institutionalization of key international works networks, including World Economic Forum. Under his guidance, Inegro, that's one of their flagship companies, has become Pakistan's first company to sign a commitment sponsored by the World Economic Forum International Business Council to implement stakeholder capitalism metrics in Pakistan. And he's also vice chairman at the BIC, which also joined the World Economic Forum and the Global Plastic Action Partnership to promote circular economy. And that's where it comes down to the farm gate again. Like anywhere there's non-wastage, something you can do further out in the country without having to rely on delivery systems back into a centralized location. Like if you can harvest it out there and refine it out there and turn it into a higher value product, which then can be transported, you're cutting probably 70% of that entire weight volume to get it to another place. Being that deep and involved inside the World Economic Forum on their policy board for, like I say, commitment to sponsor stakeholder capitalism metrics. We hear all these, key words all the time, do we not? But here's the thing, we're Bank for International Settlements, Austin, Karstens, we don't know who's using a $100 bill. We don't know who's using a 1,000 peso bill. Hey, Karsten, you don't need to know. Privacy, my friend, privacy. The key difference with CBDC is the central bank will have absolute control on the rules and regulations that will determine the use of that expression of the central bank's liability, meaning if you speak out against XYZ class of people, XYZ business genre, XYZ government overseership, they're going to cut your access to it. Again, seeing the inner workings and the depths into this, it seems some people got spooked in emerging markets and said, whoa, good for the commerce, not good for the regular people. Little change of heart, big repercussions underwater. So this comes off Tom Emmer, he's a Republican, Minnesota. Not only would central bank digital currency models centralize Americans' financial information, leaving it vulnerable, but it also be used as a surveillance tool. And Americans should never tolerate this from their government, uniparty, whatever it is now. It's morphed into something different than what was originally intended. I'm sure we all see that. If you're here watching this broadcast, you see it. So if you do want to follow along and you are interested in how central bank digital currencies are or evolving, are they in the pilot program, are they under development, or how's it working, you can go right here to cbdctracker.org and you can see the development mechanisms in every single country across the planet. Now, what I found interesting in Africa, it is going to leapfrog and they're going to borrow others' technology. So there might not be a very specific one from Mali, but they'll probably tag on to the one from Egypt or something like this. And they'll just cross swap through and they'll use the same technologies. And the African Union has its own African Union, so they share technologies, economy, transportation. So why would they not share logistics and inner workings for central bank digital currencies that could run through Africa on stablecoin payments? Of course they could. So a lot of these that are marked in white, they're never going to have their own CBDC programs. They're going to piggyback on others on the infrastructure. But anyway, it gives you a good idea. So the question was posed then, as we're moving into the central bank digital currencies in Pakistan, and, the leading heads like Shahzada Dawood and companies at that level intertwined with the World Economic Forum, they are a direct seat at the table in these discussions. So what happened? It seems like somebody said, we don't want that. And suddenly, they're a major news headline with the son who was going to be the heir to the company. One of them, he has several sons. So should Pakistan explore central bank digital currencies? Here's where it gets into, there are 100 million unbanked adults in Pakistan. So they needed electricity to give them phones to get them onto the systems. Now, how are you going to do that in a rapid fashion? You're not going to string lines and telephone poles and copper cables all over the whole country. That's going to be cumbersome, prone to attacks everywhere, and it's just not going to happen. So you're going to have to leapfrog that. Well, you can say, well, yeah, we can go to solar panels, but then you know the inverters need the batteries. It's vulnerable. You got to leave it outside. It's bulky. You need to leave it outside. It's huge. You need to collect a huge amount of power to power a village. You know, we're not talking about square meters to power a village anymore. You're talking about acres or hectares of coverage. But magnetic motors are smaller, half the size of this desk, that can run inside multiple homes. One of the devices would be enough at their power consumption usage for probably 10 homes. Something the size of this that could tuck in the corner. This is the kind of leapfrog technologies, disruptive technologies that were being referenced and talked about in the rollout to get central bank digital currencies up into the mountains. Now there's this loggerhead, like 2 rams coming at it. The additional, we got to milk every dollar by all this infrastructure, needless things. Again, copper cabling, poles, labor, roads, all these things that were unneeded. Or we just take the power direct and it just use their power direct there, and then they just use it on site and there's no connection. But then somebody's going to lose out on the money. And this is where it runs into it. Most of these are women. Out of 100 million unbanked, most are women. And that was one of the focuses that their company and organization was on, was the empowerment and betterment and enrichment of, you know, that base level of society. Start with the women first. Start with the villages first. You're going to bring it all up at that point. If a bubble's in the countryside, it's definitely going to meet the city at some point. But going from the city out there, everything's overlooked, as we see already what's happening. So these technologies are based on local solutions. This guy had it. He really did. Shahzada Dawood, he understood it, but he paid for it, literally paid for it with his life. So how does that wind back into the original sinking of the Titanic, which gets even stranger who the captain of that sub was, based on the people who were on the Titanic originally. So these 3 men worth $11 billion of today's money. Benjamin Guggenheim, you've heard of the Guggenheim Museum, that person. Issa Strauss, Macy's, you've heard of Macy's out of New York, Macy's Day Parade, that person. And Jacob Astor, you ever heard of the Astor Hotel? That person. Now, they were all opposed to central banks being set up. This is when they had the meetings in 1910. But if we look at Isidore Strauss, owner of Macy's, and his wife, Ida, you know, they were famous. They were the ones who were in the bed in the Titanic when it sank in the movie. So you look at this, you go, all right, well, a billionaire, they're opposed to it. Now, how is it different? Well, the submersible pilot's spouse is a great-great-granddaughter of these same people. So the woman that you see there, I'll back the slide up, this woman here, Ida Strauss, descendants, bring it down to the great-great-granddaughter. She was the captain of the sub that just went missing. How strange is that? A little woo-woo for my taste. Something's really, you know, strangely connected here. So if we do look at the Titanic victim, 1912, not the recent 1912, we got John Jacob Astor, Benjamin Guggenheim, and Isidore Strauss. Now, they saw the dangers inherent with the rolling out and the Federal Reserve policies. And by the way, the Federal Reserve is not federal, and it's not a reserve in any way, shape, or form. It prints currencies and charges interest on you to devalue your dollars. And that's why when you buy something, it's worth nothing and you're paying double for your groceries. And it's not federal. There's nothing federal about it. What the federal is the U.S. Treasury that mints coinage, gold and silver coinage. That's federal. These are fake federal. They put a fake name up there, Federal Reserve. They print money out of thin air. They loan it to the American government at interest, which has to be paid back. Now, how much are the interest payments currently? Something around $1 trillion a year, because they were given the power to loan the American government the money going around the Treasury, and then once that money was issued, we, the taxpayers, got stuck getting gouged 2% per year to pay them back. That 2% goes into their money pockets of the elite class. There's more like the leisure class, the parasite class, is being funded by your tax dollars that are minted through the Federal Reserve. You want to talk about counterfeiting, the feds, that's it. So they saw that. way back before the Fed was even formed in 1913. Now here's another factoid that might go into the woo-woo category. John Jacob Astor, Waldorf Astoria, who was famous that stayed at the Waldorf Astoria for many, 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 many years and also received funding from John Astor, no less than Nikola Tesla. Now you got to remember at the time, Nikola Tesla had gotten funding from J.P. Morgan, but building Wycliffe Tower in 1901, they destroyed it in 1917. He ran out of money because the real building project should have been closer to probably about $1 million, but J.P. Morgan gave him $150,000 at that time. Should have been closer to $1 million even at that time to build up wireless technologies, transmission towers. So he got the loan from J.P. Morgan to start on this original project of the Wycliffe Tower. He ran out of money. Guess who gave him the money that was into wireless technologies? John Jacob Astor, who perished in the Titanic also. You can't tell me there's this much intertwining with free power devices. And even at that time, 100 plus years ago, they were going to stop the rollout of copper cables across the United States and the wiring and the electrification of our nation and just straight up go to wireless power and Earth's magnetic field devices. Astor bought shares in Tesla's company to fund him to continue the research when J.P. Morgan pulled out. And J.P. Morgan steps off the Titanic the moment before it leaves, and these three gentlemen are left there on the Titanic to perish. Strange. Wycliffe Tower, or Wardenclyffe Tower, excuse me. 1901, construction begins, and the American government tears it down in 1917. Now, Guggenheim was also involved with this because he and Astor saw that there would be a chance to not have to wire the planet, because Guggenheim money came from mining. And they're like, whoa, what if we stop the mining? What will happen to the world's economy if we stop mining and we don't go for the full rollout of billions of tons of copper to be mined and refined? Now, he was also talking with Tesla to see if they could use some of this new technology on Earth's magnetic field to power motors to do the mining. And also something about the vibration of the atoms itself to recombine them and pull them literally out of the rock versus what we have to do to crush rock with substrate and add the different chemicals in it to remove the metals that we do today. They were talking about vibrational frequency to do the mining. Once the rock was out versus putting it in solvents and crushing it to actually electrify it and pull those minerals out, literally magic for a better term. That's what he was working on with Tesla, and they both ended up on the boat at the same time on the Titanic. A little strange from my, once you dig into this, it gets strangely bizarre. The tech that was around in the early 1900s blows what we have away today. We've gone back in time. We've gone caveman style back. We're living in square caves. So the ending of the panic in 1907. Now, how did Morgan get his fingers into all these things here? Well, the panic of 1907, there was a stock market crash, everything was collapsing, complete collapse, shutdowns, bank runs, upheaval across America in 1907. But John D. Rockefeller committed his own funds, and then J.P. Morgan committed his own funds, but then he persuaded all these other banks along with politicians to declare a state of emergency. And then the Aldrich Act was passed in 1908. That's the Vreeland Act from Mr. Aldrich, who shall go down in infamy of selling out our nation. What it established at that point was once they had the banking contagion, they had all these big magnates and giant, banking interests throw in money to bail out our government. Our government was beholden to them at that point. They bailed out a complete collapse of the United States. So all they did was ask one single request. We want to form this new body called the Federal Reserve and be in control of the money because you obviously can't do it. Your whole country collapsed and we had to bail you out. We're the only ones that can control the money. And Nelson Aldrich, senator, got this thing inked. And I couldn't believe it. When they inked it? December 23rd, when everybody from Congress and when they were all out. Everybody was out. They were back home for Christmas. Remember, there was no internet back then. Telephones were sketchy at best. Everybody was home for Christmas break. And when did they do this? The 23rd in the evening, December 23rd, to get this passed. There was nobody in session. They just went in, passed it, nobody here. Anybody object? Nobody's there. So there's 18 members on this, and it's a National Monetary Commission. And this is how these are all totally interlinked. Now, if you want to do more research, the Jekyll Island group is the final pull from this. So Paul Warburg, these are some of the famous, names. And then Senator Nelson Aldrich found himself on the board controlling what was then billions of dollars. Convenient. Politician steps right into that board of governors. Wow. How did that happen? And you can see the smugness around the table there. Creature from Jekyll Island is a great book to read. Now, if you look at who the final 7 were that were controlling the money after that, the only 3 that were opposed to it weren't at that table, and they were on the Titanic that sank. Convenient or just coincidental? I'm curious. And then World War I started just less than a year later after all of this was complete. Hey, you can print money to create weapons now out of thin air. Again, the steps in progression, World War II, and now we see ourselves at the cusp of World War III. We're going to continue with Nikola Tesla when we come back from the break.